It's that simple. And with that, we'll hand it over to Ellen Zegura.
Thank you. So I'm Professor Ellen Zegura. I'm a professor in the School of Computer Science. I have an undergrad degree in electrical engineering, so I'm one of you, and at least in some spirit. And I've been at Georgia Tech for over 20 years, since 1993. So it would help me actually to have you all just introduce yourselves and tell me what program you're in. And I think we agreed I would talk about the tenure process. So also if, as we're going around, you have any specific kind of question about it, I'll take some notes and make sure to cover that in addition to what I would cover anyway. But also you could wait and ask questions after I've said some things about it. So please.
I'm Lauren Pretty. I was finishing my 4th year in bioengineering. I'm interested in academia.
I'm Jenna. I'm same program as Lauren, also finishing up 4th year and entering 5th year in bioengineering. I'm Courtney. I'm starting my 2nd year in water resource engineering. I'm also interested in academia. Don't really know much at all about science, so I need like a 101.
I'm Ellie. I will start my Ph.D. program from this fall, and I was enrolled as a master's student last year. Yeah. I have no idea about the tenure.
What program are you in?
Transportation engineering.
I'm Fauna. I'm a 1st year MS student currently in mechanical engineering.
Hi, I'm Brittany. I'm starting my 2nd year and PhD in electrical engineering.
I'm Astrid. I'm a 5th year PhD student in mechanical engineering, hopefully graduating very soon. My name's Stephanie. I am going into my 3rd year PhD program in electrical engineering.
I'm Laura, and I am going into my 2nd year of the robotics PhD program through mechanical engineering.
Hi, my name is Renee Cottle, and I'm going into my 5th year in biomedical engineering, and I'm also interested in academic careers.
I'm Shira. I'm finishing up my master's degree in environmental engineering. Not sure what I'm going to do yet.
Right. So some of you expressed a definite interest in academia, in which case the tenure process is quite important. And others of you aren't sure, or maybe didn't say so, but don't have any intention to go into academia. I was thinking a little bit while I was driving in this morning that actually understanding the tenure process is kind of useful even if you don't intend to participate in it yourself, because it's so important to faculty. And so it might help explain or lend some insight into faculty behavior that you otherwise wouldn't have. And I definitely think that, at least if I reflect on my own experience, many students, especially if you're an undergrad, it's just an invisible process, and generally speaking, faculty don't talk about it to undergrads. And so it's something happening that's actually very important to faculty, and yet you don't get exposure to it. So it could be of interest even for those of you who just want to have a better understanding of the sets of things that that faculty are spending time on and priorities. So I'll do a kind of 101, and maybe that will also generate some other questions. And I'll do it really with an emphasis on the way it works in computing and in engineering. So other disciplines, the same general structure is followed, but some of the considerations, for example, for what is important to demonstrate at tenure time are somewhat discipline specific, though I think engineering and computing are similar enough that I'll be able to speak to both of those. Also, I should tell you, my perspective on this comes from going through the tenure process at Tech. I also was interim dean of the College of Computing in 2002 for 6 months between the one dean and the next. And in that time period, I attended, there's an institute level, Georgia Tech wide meeting of cases that are they happen to be third-year review cases, but in any case, it's a version of the promotion and tenure. It's one of the promotion and tenure meetings, and I went as the dean to that meeting. I also was chair of computer science from 2005 to 2012, so I've seen it, on both sides, and then on the and at multiple levels of the process. So the kind of short version, I guess, is that tenure is a process that faculty go through at universities, and it although there's some potential for this to change, it currently means that once you have tenure, you have a job for life, provided you don't screw up in some pretty substantial way. So it's high, and also if you don't get tenure, you don't have a job. So it's very high stakes. A faculty member will come in, after having completed a Ph.D., potentially done some time as a postdoc, and will start as a junior faculty member without tenure. And then has a time period that's a fixed time period. At Georgia Tech, the normal thing is to go up for tenure in your 6th year. So you have 5 years to sort of build a record on which you're judged at the time of tenure. And it is an up or out. So that does make for very high stakes. When you go up for tenure, you create a set of documents that are intended to help reviewers assess. You make your own case through these documents, and then they're sent to external people who are considered to be experts in the field, who are asked to write letters assessing you, your past work and your potential. And also internal review committees have access to those documents. So there are generally 3 things that you prepare: a detailed CV, a detailed resume, which lists a huge amount of information, including things like, so of course it has the courses you've taught and what the enrollments were in those, and it has the papers that you've written, conference papers, journal papers. It has students that you've supervised, including undergraduate supervision and graduate student supervision. If you were really crazy, you might put that you had been invited to speak to a SWE lunch group on the tenure process. So there's some representation of things that you do in the category of service, which is what this is for me. So it's a detailed CV, much longer than you would ever use if you were a job candidate for an industry position. At least if you were at the PhD level, we tend to have long CVs because we do tend to include publications. If you're applying for a research position, they're interested in your publication. A research statement where you have a chance to summarize and highlight elements of the research accomplishments, and usually a small amount on what you're thinking about going forward. And a teaching statement where you explain things like your philosophy of teaching and the things that you've done that might be innovative around course teaching. So you prepare those. So in terms of process, you prepare those documents, you sort of hand them over, and then there's a committee, usually a small group of people who make some decisions about who to ask for letters. And sometimes the candidate has some input into that, in which case, of course, you pick people that are senior enough and that you have some reason to believe are, have admiration and respect for your work. They also put in other people, so it's never just who the candidate suggests. So, and there's a pretty high bar for the quality of those people. So they have to be tenured themselves. And full professors are preferred, so that's the highest. Assistant, associate, full, that's the progression. So more senior people are preferred, better, strong institutions are preferred, and and other marks of distinction get looked at. So, if they've a member of the National Academy of Engineering would be a super top distinction, but things like a fellow of the IEEE would be another distinction that might be looked at to kind of judge the quality of these letter writers. So they send out the materials, they ask letter writers if they're willing, and they send them the materials, and that's all confidential. So the candidate never knows, is not supposed to know, who the letter writers were, and the letter writers usually have a couple months to do their work, and then they return a letter that gets used, and is, in many cases, those letters are a really key part of the process, because internally in a department, it depends on how big it is. Engineering here is big enough that in nearly all cases there would be local people who have a pretty decent appreciation for the kind of contributions of the person, but not always. And sometimes, someone works in an area that nobody local that's senior, knows a tremendous amount about. Plus, we always like to give pretty heavy weight to the opinions of these outside people who are writing this letter. So the letters come back. The materials are looked at, read carefully, and then the department, the school, makes a recommendation about tenure. Then it goes through multiple levels. So the school makes a recommendation. The chair of the school makes an independent recommendation. There's a college level committee, so College of Engineering committee, that makes a recommendation. The dean of the College of Engineering makes a recommendation. So now you've got 4 recommendations, 2 from committees, school and the college, and 2 from administrators, the chair of the school and the dean. And all that stuff gets wrapped up and sent up to the top level of the university. And then there is a meeting of the provost, the deans, the head of promotion and tenure for each college. And the dean presents each case, and then there's a vote. So that was another recommendation based on this vote. And then it goes to the provost and the president, and they make the final determination. And Board of Regents basically rubber stamps. Yeah.
I'm just curious, so if the initial committee recommends it, is it typical for the rest to follow suit, or where the cutoff decision?
Right. So, and there's a little bit of variation across schools, and I don't know how all of the schools in engineering do it. So I'll tell you, in computing, we do a vote. That the recommendations that are committee recommendations are actually a vote. They're not yes, no. Of course, the individual recommenders, the chair and the dean, would make a yes, no. So there's more subtlety to the information that's coming up, because you can see the vote, and you can see if it was how close it was to unanimous in one direction or the other, or if it was quite split. So in any individual case, things can happen that might surprise you. So it's in the very nicest case, easiest cases, the recommendations are consistent all the way up, and hopefully, and in most cases of that kind of a vote, they're positive, right? So very strongly positive, if not unanimous, vote in the school, positive from the chair, very strongly positive vote at the college level, positive from the dean, and the case kind of sails through. There are also cases, although it's somewhat rare, and I'll explain why, to have a very strong and consistent negative outcome. The reason that's unusual is that Georgia Tech has a fairly robust intermediate review at the 3rd year, and that 3rd year also goes all the way up to this institute committee, and that's the meeting that I participated, that took place during the 6 months I was interim dean. So Georgia Tech has a fairly robust process for doing a a mid-course evaluation at a point where it's it's chosen to be far enough in that you can make some judgment about where things seem to be going, but not so far that you can't, the candidate doesn't have time to make some mid-course corrections that could affect the outcome. There's also, if you get a negative review at that stage, you go through the whole review process again the next year. So there, it's not that you operate in a, toil away with no information until you get to the tenure point. There are feedback points along the way that are part of the official process. Also, the school chair is supposed to write an annual evaluation letter for each faculty member every year, whether they're tenure or not. And certainly, when I was chair, the letters to the untenured faculty were the ones that I spent the most time on, because I thought that getting those folks good feedback and detailed feedback was extremely important. So the negative all the way up would be a pretty unusual circumstance, because generally people who receive negative feedback at the third year review, if it's pretty strongly negative, would look for another job. There's some stigma associated with not getting tenure. Though many people who don't get tenure at one place go on to be successful at other places. So it's not it's stigma in the sense that kind of an element of, it's not a positive event. Nobody wants to fall into that category, but it also isn't it's not a career ender. And especially if you say didn't get tenure at a place that's really quite strong, there are often places at the next tier down that might be quite delighted to have a faculty member who was operating at this higher level, but perhaps not quite high enough for the standards of that institution. So these standards are very local. The kind of record that would be expected for tenure at a place like Georgia State is quite different than the record that would be expected at a place like Georgia. So that probably answers your question. But actually, there's a third category that's more complicated, of which you can imagine, which is the one in which the things are mixed. And when things are mixed, it typically means that it's a hard decision, and that individuals then call on their own sort of internal sense of what is important to get tenure. And reasonable people can differ quite a bit with respect to what they think should be counted as more important. And that's almost always what happens. Somebody has some strengths and some weaknesses. And so then if you happen to think that the areas in which they're weak are the most important, you're more likely to reach a negative outcome. Whereas if you think that the areas in which they're weak are not that important, then you could reach a positive outcome. Here's an example: teaching quality. Okay. How important is teaching quality? Well, we are not consistent about that. And we sometimes, and you all have probably may have had some experience with this, we sometimes allow someone who is not a great teacher to receive tenure, typically because they're very strong in other things. Hopefully we don't allow someone to get tenure who's a terrible teacher, even if they're fantastic in many other things. But you may have seen examples where it looks like that might be what happened at some point in the past, maybe even the very distant past. But that's an example where any individual faculty member or administrator might choose to say, I can let these weaknesses, I don't like them, I wish the person was stronger, I'd like to help them get stronger, but they're balanced by some pretty significant strengths. But also, you could reasonably reach the completely opposite outcome. You were going to ask a question.
Yeah, my question was, so I feel like with the tenure process, everybody who's thinking about academia is all stressed about the tenure process because it's a big deal.
It's high
make or
stakes.
break for you. Yeah. But how common is it for people to get recommended to not get tenure or whatever? Because I feel like I know a decent amount of faculty, and I haven't ever heard of that happening. But
Right.
is it a really uncommon thing, or is it just more common than I realize?
It's probably in between. So it shouldn't be common, because if it is common, then something has been broken in the feedback process. So if it were to become quite common, that's really an indication of an institutional problem. That said, it happens. And which department are you in?
I'm in electrical engineering. I mean, I'm sure it's happened in my department. I've just never.
It probably
heard of
has.
anyone.
Right. I mean, ECE is big enough that
Yeah.
if we looked over a long enough time period,
Yeah.
almost certainly it has happened. It has happened in the College of Computing. It's rare, but the fact that it can happen is kind of enough to cause quite a bit of anxiety, right? I mean, so for nobody, it's never, no one would be told, you're gonna get tenure. You have to, you have to do the things that create the record, so you hope that it happens rarely, because the feedback mechanisms are there, and someone who's not on track gets that message and gets as much help as can be offered to try to correct it, and then if that's not successful, chooses to leave before they would be at that decision. Yeah.
So everybody's kind of helping you succeed.
That's the idea.
Okay.
Right? So, and it just varies. The helping can come from a number of different sources. So, depending on the department you're in and the prevalence of senior faculty in your area, and whether those senior faculty are both aware and skilled at mentoring, they can be a source. So you might get some of this help very locally. The faculty member next door who's been around for 10 years and you've just arrived. Sometimes those sorts of folks are not available, or they don't do it as part of their job, or they're not good at it. It's its own skill. The chair can play a role for sure. In a very, very big department, the chairs spread pretty thin, across all the faculty. So some chairs then would be able to manage that, but in other cases it may be, they may assume explicitly or implicitly that more of it happens within the research, sub-research domain. It can happen with external people. So, you do build a network of researchers at other places who work on problems similar to yours, and it's actually a super good strategy to start cultivating some of those people as mentors, because then they have an investment. First of all, they can give you a perspective that you might not get locally because they're somewhere else. Also, they then have an investment in your success. So if you seek their advice on issues that you're facing, then at tenure time, that's someone who would really be awesome to write you a letter, because they've really watched your career and they have perhaps felt that they've taken some vested interest in your success.
I have a question about the number of opportunities available for tenure track positions, because a lot of times you hear about these tenure positions being in a decline, especially in a difficult economy or when funding is not as available.
Right.
So could you just comment about that, or
Sure.
provide some advice?
Yeah. Right. So, top academic positions are highly competitive. There are lots of people getting PhDs who are interested in academic positions, and of course, the number of them is determined actually by a number of complicated factors, including for state schools, state budget, right? So if the state of Georgia, Georgia Tech's budget from the state decreases, that can have an impact on faculty hiring. also enrollments. So if enrollments go up, that helps make a case for more faculty. Doesn't mean, you know, that we always see a direct relationship between enrollment changes. So, so there's a lot of competition for top positions. And federal funding for research is also a very competitive process. So all that probably sounds discouraging. Now, on the plus side, you all are at a fantastic place, and so you're and you know, you have an opportunity to work with terrific faculty and to do really, you know, the kind of research work that could make you competitive for these positions. Also, there are many tenure track positions of various types. So a Georgia Tech faculty member position is sort of in this top tier kind of category, but there are many other opportunities, including positions. At engineering, there's a little less of this, computer science a little more, but to be at a teaching university where you would spend most of your time teaching. Now, oftentimes teaching universities, the prevalence of engineering in them is not as high, because engineering needs labs and resources that some other, for instance, computer science can be done with more limited, you know, some types of computer science can be done with fewer resources. So a liberal arts school might have a computer science major, but might not have an engineering. But there are quite a range of types of tenure track positions. The other positive is there's just not that many women faculty in engineering. And, you know, there's pretty strong evidence and I think increasing commitment on the part of departments to not, you know, to pay attention to this. And so at some places it is a factor in hiring. It's usually not, I mean, you have to be above the bar from, in terms of other standards that the department would apply, but it can be an advantage, and that's great, because then you'll get in there and be able to, you know, just take your best shot at doing an excellent job. I don't think, since we're talking about tenure, I don't think being an underrepresented minority makes any difference at tenure time. So it may help you get an interview, it may help you get a job offer, but then you have to succeed on your, you know, on your own merits. And I've never heard a discussion that goes, well, if we don't tenure this person, you know, we won't have any female faculty, or we won't have any African American faculty. Or, you know, that tenure commitment is, because it's so significant, right? It's really a lifetime. It's a lifetime commitment. I've never heard that become an issue at that point, but it could help in. And there's plenty of people who are qualified for these jobs. So if there's an edge that is available to you, take it, because you're qualified. So it's just, you know, it's now about kind of making fine distinctions between a collection of qualified people, and you'll have to prove it. You know, you'll have to. Yeah.
So you said it goes assistant, associate, and then full. How do you go from assistant to associate?
Right. So in the most standard case, the transition from assistant to associate takes place at the same time as the consideration for tenure. So you come in as an untenured assistant professor using the Georgia Tech model, which is quite standard. There are a few notable places that do things a little bit differently. But come in, you know, you spend 5 years building a research program, working with students at undergraduate and graduate levels, submitting papers to conferences and journals, getting them accepted, you know, applying for grants, hopefully having some of them funded, and then you know, document all of this in these various materials and submit them, I'm sorry, I forgot your question. Oh, yeah. So you submit them, and that's for tenure and promotion to associate professor. And they technically are considered separately, so this voting and this recommendation, there's one recommendation that's about tenure and one recommendation that's about associate professor. But it's extremely rare for those to be different. There's technically some differences between them in that the tenure is this kind of lifetime commitment, whereas associate professor just says, well, you're ready for rank promotion, a promotion, and yet we don't want to have you around forever, which is a little bit of a funny thing to say. And that's almost always if they differ, it would be in that direction. That is, you're ready for a promotion, but we don't want you around forever. If we want you around forever, generally speaking, we agree that means you're ready for a promotion. So those are most typically coupled. And then the next step, which is from associate to full, is the stakes are not as high there, right, because you have tenure. So that's not an up or out. Furthermore, the time at which that takes place is not rigidly structured, whereas the step from, well, the tenure step, it has a rigid timeline to it. So there's some recommended minimums for this step from associate to full. There are faculty members who remain at the associate professor level for their whole career. So you may know some of those, or if you see a faculty member who's an associate professor, but you know they've been around for a long time, you know this is a case where they haven't made that step. So kind of a typical timing for someone who's quite successful, you know, 4 or 5 years after promotion to associate would be a kind of typical timeline for a promotion to full. That process also goes and involves outside letters, creating, you know, the same documentation materials, outside letters. Now this, you know, from even, you know, possibly even better people, right? More senior people, and the same process I described at all the different levels is used for promotion to full. That's a promotion that we would typically see very few negative outcomes because you don't have, there's no time, there's no clock that's forcing you to go through that transition. So in almost all cases, somebody wouldn't go through it, they wouldn't try until it was pretty assured that they were going to get it. So very unusual to see somebody not go up for promotion to full and not get it. It's at the discretion of the faculty member. So someone could insist, you know, it might be getting coached, you know, you're on the right track, you're not quite there yet, you should wait another year or two. They can push it, they can push the issue, and they can insist, and so sometimes that doesn't go well. But that's unusual. Yes?
Does age come into account at all? Just out of curiosity.
You know, I've never heard it in a discussion at any of these, for any of these kinds of things. Yeah, well, as you know, legally, it can't. It doesn't happen so much in computer science that, so of course, if you go directly through the whole process, then everybody's more or less the same age. If you've done other kinds of things, either, you know, before completing a Ph.D. and going to faculty position and that, or just somebody who was older, I would say, you know, there might be situations where it's an advantage, in fact, simply because you have more life experience, more things to draw upon, potentially more maturity. So I don't think it's a. I mean, plus, your lifetime's not going to last as long as those young people, so the lifetime commitment is hedged or something. You know, so I really have not. There are fields where it's hard to come back to research. So it may be tough for someone who has taken a, you know, for instance, finishes a PhD and goes and does something that's not research to try to come back and get a faculty job. But that's not because of age, it's because they've been out of the research community for a period of time, and getting back in is often quite difficult because the field is moving, and keeping up with techniques and interesting new problems and that sort of thing takes, more or less takes being, it's hard to do it without being in it.
I've heard of, maybe this is just something that I've heard somewhere along the way, but sometimes they'll bring in 2 associate professors and then only one of them is going, or 2
Assistant? The lowest?
Yeah, 2 assistant and only one of them is going to get to the associate. Is that common? Is that just something that they scare undergrads with?
There's a language for that, and it's this language of slots. So how many slots do you have, which sometimes means how many, often used to mean how many tenured, tenured slots. So for your department, you've got 35 faculty, maybe you have 1 open slot, which means the university is willing to, commit to essentially a lifetime salary for 1 more person. And you hear about places where they will bring in as assistant professors more people than they have slots, and they will just tenure the best one, or tenure, assuming, so tenure the best one unless none of them are good enough, and then they won't tenure anything. Georgia Tech doesn't operate that way. So everybody that's hired could be tenured. And really, that's what we would like to have happen, because it's quite an investment by the university in a person's career, a new faculty member's career. You may know this, in addition to salary, there are startup packages that are meant to help you get your lab going. And if there's equipment that you have to do your work, to let you buy that equipment before you've written grant proposals, because sometimes you need to be able to do some work before you write the proposal. Also, there are delays. So graduate student support, space, funds that would let you buy equipment needed to do your work, summer salary support for some period of time. These are all elements of typical startup packages. So the university's actually made quite an investment in your success, and so it's best for everyone if most people then are successful. But there are places that you hear have this kind of a policy. There are also places that are, and I don't know that this happens. I don't know if this really happens in engineering. I guess it may. There's a few places at the super top that if you were to not get tenure there's so many other places that would be so happy to have. Assuming you were quite successful, just not quite at this very, very, very top bar. Plenty of other places that are very happy to have you as a faculty member. Now, so I'm not. Georgia Tech doesn't work that well, and I think. Well, I hope that there are a few places these days that do. It's a little problematic from a legal standpoint, in that if you're now comparing 2 people and you pick one, absolutely you rank them. It's just, that's a hard process, and it's hard to justify. I mean, in some cases, maybe quite clear cut, but it's complicated.
I'm sort of curious, and I know most of your experience is with Georgia Tech and your department,
Right.
but you collaborate with people out in other schools and at different levels of research versus teaching, and I'm sort of curious about differences you've seen in the tenure process between Georgia Tech and other schools and at different levels.
So one thing that we haven't really talked about is, except sort of as a side note about how 2 people might reach a different decision on the same case, is what does get looked at, right? So I said that the letters are looked at. Those letters almost always exclusively speak to research accomplishment, because those folks know, typically they're being asked because they're experts in your research area and they know. But there are three elements to every case: a research component, a service component, and a teaching component. And those tend to get described and thought about with some independence, although there are situations where they intertwine, especially research and teaching can intertwine, and certainly things like teaching a specialized graduate class are often indistinguishable from research. So there are these three, and within research, there are some sort of subcategories that get looked at. So publications being one, work with graduate students, for instance, whether or not you graduated a PhD student, or whether you have a PhD student, whether you have a pipeline and a PhD student, for example, who's close to graduating, and funding. So different places do weight these things, these differently. I've heard of places where you have to be kind of above a bar in all three, but with excellence in 2 out of 3. And so that would allow excellence in service and teaching, where research was above the bar, but not excellent. You know, a place, Georgia Tech wouldn't probably apply that kind of standard. Certainly we don't say that, and it would be pretty unusual. But places that are less research focused, where that's a kind of way that it's stated what the criteria is. I'm on a committee looking at the committee of the Computing Research Association, which is a organization where most of the membership are schools of computer science and information. Looking at practices for evaluating scholarly impact. And as part of that, I actually interviewed department chairs, school chairs at a small number of other places. And I heard some interesting things because we asked them things like, how do you do it? So at UMass Amherst, they ask students to write letters documenting a candidate's teaching. And if they don't, they'll solicit this from students that have taken undergraduate courses and graduate courses from that faculty member. If they don't get a lot of letters, that's considered quite negative. And so they use those letters as a part of the evaluation and take them quite seriously. So that's we don't do that here. We do look at things like the teaching evaluation scores. So if you had any doubt about the impact that can have, particularly for untenured faculty, that's a big deal. And if someone is struggling with teaching, it usually shows up in those scores, and then in a supportive department, they'd be given some forms of counseling or pointed to CETL or a variety of ways, and then they have a chance to see if those things worked, right? Because they teach the same section, teach the same class again, and get the scores again. Different places will potentially put different weights on these three things. They'll also have, particularly for research, a different bar, potentially a different bar. So, some of our conferences are stronger than others. They're harder to get in. They get more submissions. They're harder to get into. The quality of the work that's there tends to be higher. Same thing for journals. Some journals are harder to get your work accepted, and some journals take almost anything. Right? So, different places will have different expectations for, say, how much of your research work has appeared in these very strong venues versus kind of medium tier venues versus low tier venues. So that's a place where there's variation. It's less about the weight between the three, but more about where the bar is, say, within research. And similarly for research funding. In my view, in the most enlightened cases, we don't think of research funding as demonstrating research excellence. Instead, we think of it as an input. So getting, this is not to discount the competitiveness of getting research funding, but that it is what enables you to do good work. It isn't the good work itself. So, so we, in the best cases, we look for the impact of the work a person has done. That is what difference was made by having completed the research work. The only difference that's made by getting money is intellectual. Is somebody else didn't get the money. It's not getting money is not. It's not an intellectual output. That said, money's important. Bringing a lot of money, usually it correlates with high quality work, and it definitely matters in some. As funding's gotten tougher, and here I'm mostly speaking about National Science Foundation funding, I think departments are adjusting somewhat their expectations for how successful faculty are at bringing in funds. I think it remains important to demonstrate effort. So in our CVs, we actually have in the Georgia Tech CV, we have a section where we list grants that have been awarded, but we also list those that were not funded. So you have it, which I would never, nobody would ever release you wouldn't tell people outside, look at all these times I tried, and I wasn't successful. But inside, that can actually be, it lets you document effort, even if that effort turns out not to be successful. And I think I heard in some of these conversations that sort of expectations for grant success are being tempered by changes in the availability of competition. Yeah.
Do untenured faculty ever serve as the external reviewers or serve on the committee internally? Because I feel like that would be your best way to learn what to do.
Not at Georgia Tech, but there are places that, so it'd be very unusual to be asked to write a letter as an untenured faculty member, because you really are seeking kind of expert opinions. Involving untenured faculty in the process or having them participate in parts of the process, there are places that do it. Georgia Tech doesn't. I think it has very clear both positive and negative elements. Certainly, it removes some uncertainty about what the process is. But it also has the potential to heighten anxiety. So I've only been at Georgia Tech, so I have not been at a place that operates that way. I think it's more common not to have junior people involved. And actually in that promotion to full professor that I mentioned, that evaluation is only done by full professors. So the promotion from assistant to associate and tenure is one that's under the consideration of all the tenured associate and full professors. But the step to full professor, it's only the full professors that are involved in assessing that. So we also don't let the associate professors, don't know what happens at that step. Although because they've participated as associate professors in the assessment of assistant professors, they're much easier job extrapolating what they're going through at that point. It's, we in computing we try to be pretty open with junior faculty about what happens, but I think we can't really explain what the discussion is like in these meetings at which when these votes take place. It's just hard to make that very open without having people there, and so that's the source of that. What we like to tell faculty, and it's definitely true, is that you really want to be planning your career to have a successful career. You don't want to plan it sort of to get tenure. I mean you'd like that to happen as a kind of consequence, side effect of having an ambitious and and interesting and successful research agenda and teaching program and service. As many times as you say that, I think it might help a little, but still generally, it's a big deal to get tenure. Even if you're pretty sure based on feedback that you've gotten in your own independent assessment, even if you're pretty sure that you're doing fine, it's still nice. And it's still. So if you have, when you have faculty that are teaching classes, maybe now you'll be more interested to know which level here they are in, and because it does make a difference for the set of things that are probably most pressing on their minds, and the teaching evaluations for those of you who are taking undergraduate courses and doing teaching evaluations for untenured faculty. Those are playing a fairly substantial role. I think it's a little unclear. It's not a very nuanced view of someone's teaching skills, right? I mean, to get a more nuanced view, you would want to actually go to the classroom and have a chance to watch teaching. But it is the number, and it is because we use it across all classes at Georgia Tech, it is something that can be used to compare faculty from very different disciplines. Unlike, funding is more available in some disciplines and very much not available in other disciplines. So just looking at how much funding someone has or how many PhD, how large their lab is, how big their research group is, it's a little harder to compare across more distant disciplines. But teaching evaluation scores, everybody can look at those and say, well, 4.3, that's pretty good. 3.3, not so great. These are the kind of discussion.
Okay, well with that, thank
I hope
you.
I haven't scared any of you away from that. Wherever you go, whatever job you have, you're going to want to have a successful career, and tenure is. If you've had a successful career, in most cases you get tenure. So and academic life is really its own special thing. I've enjoyed it. I've been here for 20 years. So for those of you thinking about it, I hope more of this is transparency than it is making it sound more intimidating than it might. Okay, thank you all for having me.
As a reminder, please do the survey. Please do the